She tried to sell her last dress for bread until a cowboy said, "I'll feed you as my wife." The autumn wind cut through Millfield like a blade, carrying dust and the scent of dying grass across the small frontier town. Clara Whitmore stood outside Morrison's general store, her fingers trembling as she clutched the faded blue calico dress, the last remnant of her former life. The fabric had once been her Sunday best, sewn by her mother's careful hands 3 summers ago, before the fever took both parents and left Clara with nothing but debts and an empty cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows between the weathered buildings, and Clara could hear the distant lowing of cattle from the ranches beyond town. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion these past weeks. She had sold everything else, her mother's china, her father's tools, even the quilt that had covered her bed since childhood. Now only this dress remained, and the thought of parting with it felt like losing the last piece of who she used to be. "You sure about this, Clara?" Morrison's voice drifted from the store's open door. The storekeeper was a kind man, but business was business, and he had his own family to feed. Clara smoothed the dress one final time, feeling the worn softness of the fabric beneath her palms. "How much bread will it buy?" Morrison stepped onto the wooden porch, his weathered face creased with sympathy. "2 loaves, maybe 3 if I stretch it. That dress ain't worth much anymore, I'm afraid." 3 loaves would last her a week if she was careful, Clara nodded, steeling herself for what felt like another small death. As she moved toward the store, the sound of hoofbeats on packed earth made her pause. A rider was approaching from the north road, sitting tall in his saddle, despite the dust coating his dark hat and clothes. The man drew his horse to a stop near the store's hitching post. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of weathered leather. Clara noticed how gently he handled his mount, speaking in low tones as he secured the reins. There was something about his movements, deliberate and careful, like a man who had learned to be mindful of every action. "Morning, Morrison," the rider said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice carried a slight drawl that spoke of long days under open sky. "Jack Brennan," Morrison replied with genuine warmth. "Good to see you in town. How's the ranch?" Clara found herself listening despite her intention to slip into the store unnoticed. Jack Brennan. She had heard the name mentioned in hushed conversations at the boarding house, where she sometimes took in mending. A rancher who kept to himself, worked his land alone, and paid his debts on time. "Getting by," Jack replied simply. His gaze swept the street and settled briefly on Clara. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and the hunger that had carved shadows beneath her eyes. Morrison cleared his throat. "Clara here was just about to trade this dress for some bread. Times have been hard since her folks passed." Clara's face burned with embarrassment. She hadn't wanted her situation broadcast to strangers, but Morrison meant well. She clutched the dress tighter and took a step toward the store entrance. "Wait," Jack said quietly. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned slowly to find him studying her with those leather-brown eyes, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "You're trading your dress for food?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara lifted her chin, finding some remnant of pride even in her desperation. "It's mine to trade." Something shifted in Jack's expression. Not pity, but something deeper and more complex. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the dress in her hands and back again. "I'll feed you as my wife." The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water. Clara felt the world tilt slightly, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath her feet. Morrison coughed and muttered something about checking inventory before disappearing into his store. "I beg your pardon?" Clara's voice came out smaller than she intended. Jack stepped closer, but not close enough to crowd her. I have a ranch 20 miles north of here, good water, decent soil, cattle that know their way home. But it's a lonely place, and I'm tired of cooking for one." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "You need food and shelter. I need someone to share the burden of making a home. It could work." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "You don't even know me. I know you'd rather sell your last dress than steal bread from Morrison's store. I know you've been taking in mending work even when your fingers are too cold to hold a needle steady. I know you sat with old Mrs. Patterson when she was dying, even though she couldn't pay you a cent." Jack's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact. A man could do worse than marry a woman with that kind of character. "How do you know all that?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "Small town," Jack said simply. "People talk. Most of it's gossip, but some things are worth remembering." The wind picked up, stirring the dust at their feet and carrying the scent of sagebrush from the hills beyond town. Clara found herself studying this man who had just upended her world with a handful of words. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who worked with his own strength every day. His clothes were clean but well worn, mended in places with careful stitches. He carried himself like a man who had faced hard times and come through them intact. "Why?" she asked finally. Jack was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Because I remember what it feels like to be hungry. Because a woman shouldn't have to choose between dignity and survival. Because maybe we could both use a second chance at something better than what we have now." Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with such straightforward kindness? Not pity, not charity, but simple human recognition of shared struggles and hopes. "I don't love you," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "I don't love you either," Jack replied without hesitation. "But I respect you, and that's a better foundation than most marriages start with. Love might come later, or it might not. Either way, you wouldn't go hungry." The practical part of Clara's mind began calculating possibilities. Marriage would mean security, shelter, food on the table every day. But it would also mean leaving everything familiar, tying her fate to a man she barely knew, stepping into a future she couldn't predict or control. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Western romance, she found herself thinking, as if some part of her mind had stepped outside this moment to observe it from a distance, like a tale told around a campfire on cold nights. "What would you expect from me?" Clara asked, forcing her attention back to the present moment and the decision that could change her entire life. "Cooking, if you can. Help with the garden and the chickens. Company in the evenings, a partner in making the ranch feel like home instead of just a place to sleep between workdays." Jack paused, then added quietly, "I wouldn't expect more than you were willing to give, not in any way." The last words carried weight, and Clara understood their meaning. He was offering protection, not demanding submission. Partnership, not ownership. It was more consideration than she had expected from any man, let alone one she had met 5 minutes ago. "How long would I have to decide?" "Take all the time you need," Jack said. "But if you're planning to think it over, at least let me buy you breakfast while you do. A person makes better decisions on a full stomach." Clara looked down at the dress in her hands, then back at Jack's steady gaze. "All right," she heard herself say. "Breakfast sounds good." Morrison's wife, Martha, served them eggs and bacon at the small table behind the store counter, along with fresh biscuits still warm from the oven. Clara tried to eat slowly, but her body's hunger betrayed her desperation. Jack noticed but said nothing, simply pushed his own biscuits toward her side of the table without comment. "Tell me about the ranch," Clara said between bites, needing to fill the silence with something other than the sound of her own desperate eating. 160 acres, Jack said, cutting his eggs with deliberate care. Bought it from a family heading west to Oregon. They'd started a cabin and a small barn, dug a decent well. I've been building it up for 3 years now. Got maybe 50 head of cattle, some chickens, a milk cow named Rosie who's got opinions about everything. Despite everything, Clara found herself almost smiling. Opinions? She thinks the barn should be cleaned exactly when she wants it cleaned, not when I have time to do it. And she's convinced that grain should be served before dawn, not after. Jack's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. She's probably right about both things, but don't tell her I said so. Clara did smile then, just a small one, but the first genuine expression of happiness she'd felt in weeks. What else? Garden plot that does well with potatoes and beans. Apple trees the previous owners planted. They're young yet, but they'll produce good fruit in a few years. Creek runs through the north pasture, so there's always fresh water for the stock. Jack paused to sip his coffee. It's not fancy, but it's solid, built to last. It sounds peaceful. It is that. Sometimes too peaceful. A man can get lost in his own thoughts out there, and not all thoughts are good company. The admission was unexpected, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability beneath Jack's steady exterior. Clara found herself curious about those thoughts, about what had driven a man to seek solitude on a remote ranch, and what might now be driving him to seek companionship. What changed? She asked. Why now? Jack was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. This summer I helped my neighbor birth a calf that got turned wrong. Spent half the night working to save both mother and baby. When it was over, and they were both breathing steady, I realized I had no one to share the relief with. No one to tell about the way the sunrise looked after that long night, or how the mother cow nuzzled her baby for the first time. He looked up at Clara. Success doesn't mean much if there's no one to care that you succeeded. Clara understood that feeling more than she cared to admit. The small victories of surviving each day, finding work, stretching meals, keeping the cold at bay, had all felt hollow without someone to acknowledge them. She had been alone with her struggles, just as Jack had been alone with his accomplishments. What about failure? She asked. What if I'm not good at being a ranch wife? What if I can't cook well enough or work hard enough, or then we'll figure it out together? Jack interrupted gently. I'm not looking for perfection, Clara. I'm looking for partnership. Someone willing to try, to care about the outcome, to share both the good days and the hard ones. Martha refilled their coffee cups, studying Clara with the shrewd eyes of a woman who had seen many young people face difficult choices. Jack Brennan's a good man, she said quietly. Pays his bills, keeps his word, helped us fix our roof last spring when the storm damage was more than Morrison could handle alone. Martha, Morrison called from the front of the store. Customer out here needs help. She patted Clara's shoulder gently before returning to her duties. Clara found herself alone with Jack again, the weight of decision pressing down on her like a physical thing. Can I see the ranch before I decide? She asked. Of course. We could ride out this morning if you want. I'll bring you back to town tonight, or you could stay in the spare room if you decide you want more time to think things through. The idea of leaving town, even temporarily, both frightened and excited Clara. She had lived her entire life within a few miles of Millfield, rarely venturing beyond the familiar streets and faces. The thought of seeing new country, breathing air that didn't carry the scent of her failures and losses, appealed to her more than she had expected. I don't have a riding dress, she said, gesturing to her simple work clothes. That won't matter. Rosie's old but steady, and I've got a side saddle that belonged to the previous owner's wife. If you can sit a horse, we'll manage fine. Clara nodded, her decision made before she fully realized it. All right, let's go see this ranch of yours. Liege. An hour later, Clara found herself mounted on a gentle bay mare named Belle, following Jack north along a dirt road that wound through rolling hills covered in golden grass. The morning sun warmed her back, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than desperation driving her forward. Jack rode slightly ahead, pointing out landmarks along the way. A distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point, a grove of cottonwoods where deer came to drink, the distant line of mountains that formed the western boundary of his land. He was a comfortable companion, speaking when there was something worth saying, but not feeling compelled to fill every silence with words. As they traveled, Clara found herself studying the country around them with new eyes. She had always thought of the frontier as harsh and unforgiving, a place where people struggled just to survive. But from horseback, with the wind carrying scents of sage and wild grass, the landscape seemed vast and full of possibilities rather than merely dangerous. "There," Jack said, pointing ahead to where the road crested a low hill. "Home." Clara drew rein beside him and looked down at the valley spread below. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that spoke of warm fires and cooked meals. The barn stood nearby, flanked by corrals that held several horses and the promised cattle. Gardens' plots lay dormant now in the autumn light, but she could imagine them green and productive in spring. Everything looked well-maintained and purposeful, the work of someone who took pride in creating something lasting. But more than that, it looked like home. Not just shelter, but a place where a person could belong. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. Jack seemed pleased by her reaction. "Come on, I'll show you around, introduce you to Rosie." They spent the next hour touring the ranch, Jack explaining his routines and plans with the quiet enthusiasm of a man who had found his calling. Clara met Rosie, who indeed had strong opinions and wasn't shy about expressing them. She saw the vegetable garden, the chicken coop, the creek that provided fresh water year-round. Everything was exactly as Jack had described it, solid, practical, built to endure. But Clara also noticed details he hadn't mentioned. Wildflowers planted around the cabin's foundation, a wooden bench positioned to catch the evening light, wind chimes made from polished stones that sang softly in the breeze. These touches spoke of a man who valued beauty as well as function, who understood that a home needed grace as well as shelter. "The cabin has 2 bedrooms, Jack said as they approached the front door. "The smaller one was meant for children, I think, but it would serve well enough until—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Until we knew each other better," Clara finished for him. "Yes." The cabin's interior was clean and sparsely furnished, but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with wooden chairs positioned to catch its warmth. The kitchen was compact but well organized, with a good stove and plenty of storage. Clara could imagine cooking here, preparing meals that would be shared rather than eaten alone in silence. "What do you think?" Jack asked as they stood in the main room, afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that faced both east and west. Clara turned slowly, taking in every detail. This could be her home, her refuge from the uncertainties that had driven her to the edge of desperation. This man could be her partner, her protection against a world that had proven harsh and unpredictable. It wasn't the future she had imagined for herself, but it was a future, solid and real and within reach. "I think," she said carefully, "that it would be foolish to say no." Jack nodded once, a quick, decisive movement. "Then we're agreed?" "We're agreed. But I want to be clear about expectations. I'll do my part to make this work, but I won't be taken for granted or treated like property. Partnership means both people have a say in decisions that affect their lives." "Fair enough," Jack replied without hesitation. "Same goes for me. This is an agreement between equals, not a master and servant arrangement." They shook hands on it, Clara's smaller fingers briefly enclosed in Jack's calloused grip. The gesture felt both formal and intimate, sealing a bargain that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "When?" Clara asked. "Soon as you're ready. Preacher comes through town twice a month, but Morrison's authorized to perform marriages in emergencies. If you want to wait for the preacher, that's fine by me. If you want to get it done quickly, we can see Morrison tomorrow. Clara thought of her empty cabin in town, the bills she couldn't pay, the winter approaching with no reserves to see her through. Tomorrow, she said, but I want to spend tonight thinking about everything, making sure this is what I truly want. Where will you stay? Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house will let me have a room for one more night. I've been helping her with washing and mending to pay for my keep, Jack nodded. I'll come for you in the morning then, around 10, if that suits you. As they rode back to town in the gathering dusk, Clara found herself filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and terror. She was about to bind her life to a man she barely knew, venture into a future she couldn't predict, gamble everything on the hope that partnership might grow into something deeper and more lasting than mere convenience. But the alternative was slow starvation, gradual loss of dignity, eventual defeat by circumstances beyond her control. Whatever risks lay ahead, they were better than the certain destruction that awaited her if she remained alone. That night, lying on the narrow bed in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered if she was making the wisest decision of her life or the most foolish. Outside her window, the wind moaned around the building's corners, carrying the promise of winter and the need for shelter that would not disappear with wishful thinking. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Jack Brennan, ranch wife and partner to a man whose gentle hands and steady eyes had offered her hope when she had none left. It wasn't the romantic dream she had once harbored as a young girl, but it was real and solid and within her grasp. The morning of her wedding day dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the windows and the scent of winter sharp in the air. Clara dressed in her best remaining clothes, a simple brown dress that had belonged to her mother, and a shawl knitted during the long evenings after her parents' death. She had no flowers, no veil, no family to witness the ceremony, but she had made her choice with clear eyes and steady heart. Jack arrived precisely at 10, dressed in clean clothes with his hair freshly cut and his boots polished to a shine. He offered his arm as she descended the boarding house steps, and Clara was grateful for the solid strength of his support. Morrison's store was closed for the ceremony, but Martha had prepared a small celebration. Coffee and cake served on her best china, with wildflowers picked from the field behind the store to serve as decorations. The informal kindness of it brought tears to Clara's eyes. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, Morrison reading the words from a worn prayer book while Jack and Clara stood hand in hand before the store's pot-bellied stove. Clara's voice remained steady as she spoke her vows, promising to honor and cherish a man she hoped to learn to love. Jack's responses were equally calm, his grip on her hands warm and reassuring. When Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed her gently on the forehead, a gesture of respect rather than passion, acknowledging the beginning of their partnership without presuming more intimacy than she was ready to offer. "Well now," Martha said, wiping her eyes with her apron, "that's done properly. Time for cake and coffee, and then you two can start your new life together." The celebration was simple but heartfelt, with Morrison offering toasts to their future happiness and Martha pressing a jar of her best preserves into Clara's hands as a wedding gift. Clara found herself relaxed for the first time in months, surrounded by genuine good wishes and the promise of security ahead. As afternoon approached, Jack loaded Clara's few belongings into his wagon and helped her climb up to the seat beside him. She looked back at Millfield as they drove away, wondering when she might see it again and whether she would recognize herself when she did. The ride to the ranch passed quietly, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of the change they had just undertaken. Clara found herself stealing glances at her new husband, trying to reconcile the idea that this was the man she had promised to share her life with. The ranch looked different when they arrived, not just a place Clara had visited, but home. Jack carried her belongings into the smaller bedroom, setting them down with careful respect for her privacy. "I thought you might want to settle in first," he said. "Supper won't be ready for a couple hours, so you have time to make the space your own." Clara nodded gratefully. The room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the garden plot. She unpacked her few possessions, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her mother's Bible and her father's photograph on the dresser. When she emerged an hour later, she found Jack in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like heaven over the stove. Her stomach reminded her that she had been too nervous to eat much of Martha's wedding cake. "Beef stew," Jack explained, noticing her hopeful expression. "With biscuits, if you don't mind biscuits 2 days in a row." "I don't mind," Clara said, surprised to realize it was true. "Can I help?" "You could set the table if you want. Dishes are in the cabinet there." Working together in the small kitchen felt surprisingly natural, their movements coordinating without awkwardness as they prepared their first meal as husband and wife. Clara found herself wondering if this ease would continue, or if it was simply the novelty of the situation making everything seem harmonious. Supper was excellent, the best meal Clara had eaten in months. Jack proved to be a skilled cook, his stew rich and satisfying, his biscuits light and properly browned. She complimented the food honestly and was pleased to see him flush with pleasure at her praise. "I had to learn to cook when I took up ranching," he explained. "Got tired of beans and hardtack pretty quickly." "Well, you've learned well. This is wonderful." After supper, they sat before the fireplace, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who had worked hard and earned their rest. Clara mended one of Jack's shirts while he worked on repairing a bridle, their tasks requiring little conversation, but creating a sense of shared purpose. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself relaxing into this new rhythm. Marriage, she realized, didn't have to be about grand gestures or passionate declarations. It could be about quiet companionship, shared work, mutual respect, and the simple comfort of not being alone. "Clara," Jack said as the fire began to burn low, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for this chance. I'll do my best to be the kind of husband you deserve. I'll do my best to be the kind of wife you need," she replied, meaning it with all her heart. The first weeks of their marriage established routines that felt both comfortable and purposeful. Clara took over the cooking and found genuine pleasure in preparing meals that would be appreciated and shared. Jack included her in ranch decisions, seeking her opinion on everything from which cattle to sell to where to plant next year's garden. They were careful with each other, respectful of boundaries, and mindful of the fact that trust had to be earned rather than assumed. But gradually, small gestures of care began to appear, Clara mending clothes without being asked, Jack bringing her wildflowers when he returned from checking the cattle, both of them lingering over morning coffee to share observations about the weather or plans for the day. The first real test of their partnership came in November when an early blizzard struck without warning. Clara woke to find the world transformed overnight, snow drifting against the cabin walls and the wind howling like a living thing, determined to tear their shelter apart. Jack was already up, dressed in his heaviest coat and preparing to venture out to the barn. "Got to check on the stock," he said, seeing her worried expression. "Storm hit harder than expected." "Be careful," Clara said, surprised by the genuine fear she felt at the thought of him struggling through the blizzard alone. She spent the morning keeping the fire burning and hot coffee ready, watching through the frosted windows for any sign of Jack's return. When he finally appeared through the swirling snow, she felt relief flood through her like warmth from the fireplace. "Lost 2 calves," Jack reported grimly as he stamped snow from his boots. "But the rest are safe in the barn. It'll be close quarters for a few days, but they'll weather it." For 3 days, they were trapped in the cabin while the storm raged outside. Clara discovered that her new husband was good company during forced confinement. He told stories about his early days on the ranch, listened with genuine interest to her memories of life with her parents, and proved surprisingly skilled at card games. On the third night, as they sat playing cribbage by lamplight, Clara realized that something had shifted between them. The careful politeness of their early days had given way to genuine companionship, and the partnership they had agreed to was beginning to feel like something deeper and more precious. "Jack," she said, laying down her cards, "I want you to know that I'm happy here. Happier than I expected to be." He looked up from studying his hand, his expression serious in the flickering light. "Are you? Truly? Truly. This feels like home in a way that nowhere else ever has." Jack set down his own cards and reached across the small table to take her hands in his. "Clara, I need to tell you something. This arrangement we made, it hasn't stayed an arrangement for me. I've come to care for you more than I planned, more than I expected, more than might be wise given the circumstances." Clara's heart began to beat faster, but not with fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you. I know that wasn't part of our bargain, and I don't expect you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Clara looked into Jack's face and saw nothing but honest emotion. No demand, no expectation, just the simple truth of a man who had found something he hadn't been looking for. "I love you too," she whispered, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I didn't plan to, but I do." When Jack kissed her this time, it wasn't the respectful peck of their wedding day, but the deep, heartfelt embrace of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to make their lives complete. The storm passed the next morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. But inside the cabin, Clara and Jack had discovered something that would outlast any weather. A love built on mutual respect, shared work, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as practical necessities. Spring brought new challenges and new joys to the Brennan Ranch. Clara's garden flourished under her careful attention, producing vegetables that she preserved for the following winter with skills learned at her mother's side. Jack's cattle thrived on the rich grass, and he was able to sell enough stock to make significant improvements to the ranch. But the greatest change was in the relationship between Clara and Jack themselves. Love had transformed their partnership into something richer and more resilient, a bond that grew stronger with each shared challenge and success. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Clara found herself thinking back to that desperate morning when she had stood outside Morrison's store, ready to trade her last dress for bread. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day?" she asked Jack. He considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I think we would have found each other eventually," he said finally. "Maybe not that day, maybe not that way, but somehow, some things are meant to be." Clara leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "I'm glad we didn't have to wait to find out." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything she thought she needed to survive, only to discover that what she truly needed had been waiting for her all along. Not just food and shelter, but love, partnership, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful with another person. The dress she had nearly sold that day hung in their bedroom closet now, carefully preserved as a reminder of how quickly life could change and how much grace could be found in the most unlikely circumstances. She would wear it again someday, perhaps when their first child was old enough to hear the story of how their parents had found each other. If you felt something in this story, if it reminded you of love, resilience, and second chances, Please subscribe to our channel. Like, share, and stay with us. The next tale might be the one you've been waiting for. But for now, Clara was content to sit beside the man who had offered her everything when she had nothing left to give. Watching the night sky emerge above the land, they would tend together for all the years to come. Love, she had learned, was not always what you expected, but it was always exactly what you needed, arriving precisely when you were brave enough to recognize it.